Woodbridge Securities was a $1.2 billion real estate Ponzi scheme run by a guy named Robert Shapiro, who scammed over 9,000 investors before they were ultimately shut down by the SEC. Robert Shapiro himself pocketed somewhere around $40 million of investors' money over the course of the 5 years that he got away with this horrible crime, but now he is serving a 25-year prison sentence with 10 charges stacked against him. This elaborate Ponzi scheme marked one of the largest in modern history, and years later, the complex web of this scheme is still being unwound and victims are slowly being repaid. Of the thousands of men and women who were scammed by Robert Shapiro and his company, many of them were elderly, like this 90-year-old man named Anthony Elvis, who put his life savings of $160,000 into the Woodbridge Securities fund, only to never see a return, and now he's at risk of losing his home. It kills me to see so many people fall victim to schemes like this. Today, let's talk about the Woodbridge Securities Ponzi scheme. So a Ponzi scheme, by Investopedia's definition, is a fraudulent investing scam which generates returns for earlier investors with money taken from later investors, kind of similar to a pyramid scheme. They go on to explain that investors contribute money to a portfolio manager who promises the investor a return, and then when the investor wants their money back, they're paid out with incoming funds by later investors. To give a super simple visual for you guys, a Ponzi scheme starts at the top with a portfolio manager or a business manager who starts by collecting a bunch of money from a bunch of investors, and he promises those investors that they'll be repaid with a great return on their money, let's say 10%. The scam company continues to raise more and more money over time from other investors, promising the same return, and then eventually those original investors start to get antsy, so the portfolio manager takes money from the new investors and then pays the original investors their principal back plus huge returns. Those original investors naturally at this point get stoked. With the new investors convinced that this whole thing works since they got this big return on their money, they might put more money into the scheme, or even worse, start recruiting their friends and family to invest. Then the pile of money just gets bigger and bigger. All the while, the man at the top of the house is usually scraping some money out of the pile for himself to buy fancy clothes and cars and houses and stuff, and the money never ends up getting invested to begin with. A Ponzi scheme is pretty similar to a pyramid scheme, except in a Ponzi scheme, you're just investing money and hoping to get that money back at a later date. A pyramid scheme, on the other hand, you need to invest money and then spend a bunch of time recruiting other people to become a part of the pyramid scheme, and then you make money on that money when those people that you recruited recruit more people. Fun fact, by the way, the term Ponzi scheme comes from this con artist from the early 1900s. His name was Charles Ponzi. He ran the first known Ponzi scheme where he offered investors a 50% return on their money within 45 days to invest in his postage business. Sadly, there have been tons of people who have been duped by Ponzi schemes since this original one by Charles Ponzi back in the early 1900s, with the story of today's video being one of the biggest. Nothing though will compare to the one that I'm sure that everybody has heard of, and that is when Bernie Madoff orchestrated the largest Ponzi scheme in history. In that one, he scammed investors of around $65 billion. If you invested your money into Robert Shapiro and his Woodbridge Securities business, according to the filings and the salespeople on his team, you were basically investing into a hard money business. They claim that your money would be used to fund construction projects, meaning that Woodbridge would take your money, they'd loan it out to real estate developers at 10 or 15% interest, and then they would pay you a cut of that interest payment. What was tricky for me to put together for this video was exactly how much real estate Woodbridge and Robert Shapiro actually owned, because they were in fact buying some real estate. They just weren't investing in nearly as much as they claimed. They were spending more time looking for new investors to put their money into the business than they were actually looking for real estate deals. Woodbridge Securities and Robert Shapiro set up somewhere around 280 LLCs that all kind of fell under this umbrella of Woodbridge Securities, and so this just made it a lot easier for Woodbridge to make it look like they were sending your money off to real estate developers as loans. Because if you gave $100,000 to Woodbridge Securities, they would show movement of that $100,000 to one of their many LLCs, but little did you know that that LLC was actually just owned by Woodbridge and Shapiro. It wasn't wasn't actually being used to fund a real estate deal. Woodbridge employed about 130 people, many of which were salespeople, and they had offices in Florida, California, Tennessee, and Colorado, just to name a few. The company, or scam, kicked off in summer of 2012, and it ran for 5 years through December of 2017, when the company ultimately filed for bankruptcy. The reason they had to file for bankruptcy was just simply a combination of the fact that first, they were running out of money, and also they were actually under investigation for fraud. Of course, the salespeople of Woodbridge told the people who were investing their money that their money would be going to a low risk and safe investment, and that investment would earn them somewhere around a 6% return. From my perspective, a 6% return sounds pretty awful compared to the returns you can get from investing in index funds or just actively investing in real estate yourself. But we have to remember that many of the people who invested in Woodbridge Securities were elderly, so to them, they were probably just looking for a passive investment, and a 6% return on a passive investment in real estate is actually pretty attractive. Plus, that 6% number made the whole scheme seem a lot more believable because they weren't promising anything too crazy like a 20 or 30 or 40% return. After Woodbridge filed for bankruptcy and the SEC investigation concluded, it was time for Robert Shapiro to be sentenced in this massive $1.2 billion Ponzi scheme. In January of 2019, the court ordered Woodbridge and the companies associated with Woodbridge to repay around $900 million. And on top of that, they ordered Robert Shapiro to pay an additional $120 million in penalties, damages, and interest. The filing from the SEC goes on to say that Shapiro made Ponzi payments to investors and used a web of shell companies to conceal the scheme. And they say that this resolution accomplishes one of the SEC's core missions to protect retail investors. Mr. Shapiro and other defendants will be held accountable and required to pay substantial penalties for their misconduct. They weren't kidding about those penalties. $1 billion is a ton of money for all of these guys to have to cough up after what they've done here. As a result of this verdict, the Woodbridge Liquidation Trust was formed to help manage the assets going forward and ensure that the money was ending up back in the right hands, which is all still being untangled to this day. On top of the financial impact, the court also charged Robert Shapiro with a total of 10 counts, including 5 counts of mail fraud, 2 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and tax evasion. At the age of 62, Shapiro was sentenced to 25 years in prison after pleading guilty to wire fraud and income tax evasion. That liquidation trust has an entire website dedicated to the reports and claims and SEC filings, and it is seriously loaded with information. I scanned through a few of the liquidation trust forms, and the good news is that even to this day, properties and items are being liquidated to pay back the investors who lost money as a part of this Ponzi scheme. Here's an example on this page that shows the operation just actually sold some wine and a portion of the gold forfeited assets for $370,000. And it also sold 4 single-family homes for around $64 million. But then you'll see right here, there's pretty heavy administration costs to keep this whole thing going. So sadly, millions of dollars are being lost to legal and administrative fees instead of going to the victims. I read that the victims of this Ponzi scheme should expect anywhere between 50 and 60% of their original investment returned back to them at best, which that's a huge bummer, but it is kind of a positive because in a lot of stories like this, you don't hear about the investors getting any of their money back. If you enjoyed the episode today, guys, if you could hit that thumbs up button down below or leave a comment, I really appreciate it when you guys do that, and it really helps the channel out a lot. And remember to click subscribe if you're not already a subscriber. I'm putting new real estate related videos just like this one out every week. But that's all I've got for you guys this time. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, see ya.